Let's say you were to go out and dig and do archaeology, and you are finding tons of glass in the site where you are digging around. What does that mean for the site? How old is the age? And what are some other things that you can learn from this? Well, I'm going to be teaching you about that and showing you some things. Bottles come in many shapes, sizes, styles, many different things were put in them, from soda to beer to poison. This is an example of a poison bottle. There is much you can find. Medicines. All here in your state, out of state, anywhere in the world, you're going to find glass, depending on the age range you're in. And there are things, mysteries, that can be revealed when you are on a site, when you are finding and looking at the glass. So, we're going to start by talking about seams. So the seam of a bottle, or how a bottle is made, can tell you the age. This bottle does not have a seam. It is completely hand blown, and it is a pontil bottle. You can see there's a mark. It's very dark, but in there, that is a very early, like 1870s, maybe even into the 1860s, but very old beer, most likely 1870s. But this is pontiled. It's completely handmade, made by humans. That's one way you can tell the age. This is also the same. You see how there is no seam line going through there. That means that this was completely handmade. Very old bottle, not as old as the other one. This was found on East Campus UNL. And that helped me determine the site, that it was probably around the 1880s to the 1920s. Or 80s to the 1920s. So there's a lot you can tell just from the seam. Other things with the seam, you can see this one. See how it has that seam running along? It doesn't fully go up to the top of the bottle. You won't see it on the lip. That's a applied bottle. You see that the neck, the top bit, was applied by human hand. It was made, or called, blown in a mold. So those are ways you can tell with the seam how old the bottle is. Another thing that tells you that the bottle is old or has been in the ground a long time is if it's forming those air bubbles. Those are the small circles you see in the grass, or in the glass. You can't tell exact age using them, but they give you a good idea that this bottle's probably been in the ground around 100 years. So you get an estimate. A lot of bottles from like the 1930s onwards, you don't really see forming air bubbles. Air bubbles form after a long time of being in the ground. So those form after years upon years. So the next thing, we're going to go with tops of bottles. So this is an old beer bottle. The top of it right there, that is a blob top. So you see that blob tops are older. They're one of the first styles of how bottles were made, because there wasn't really molding. They don't have a lot of like machines back then, so they're making the top by hand. So it's just formed as a blob and put on top there by human hands. And they come in many different shapes, sizes. That's a blob top. It's a blob top. This is considered a blob top also. This is blown in a mold. This is a different type. It's called a hutch top, and this is a specific bottle based off the stopper in there. And you will find these bottles were made from around 1879 to 1912 or 1913. So that gives you an age range instantly there. Blob tops were made from the late 1910s into the very early 1800s, and before that, blob tops have been made for a long time, but that gives you a time range on there. You know almost certainly in the early 1900 or late 18 or in the 1800s range. Here we have a Coca-Cola bottle from Beatrice, Nebraska. This one is blown in a mold. This companies, towns, when they have actual writing on them, you can look up and you can actually find the history on when they are bottled. So this bottle is made most likely in 1911. So say I were to find this bottle or a piece of this bottle, say the writing, there's a good chance as an archaeologist, I would be able to determine that that bottle is in fact from around 1911 or onward. So I could determine my site's at least the age of a 1911. Here's another example of a Lincoln bottling works. You just see that these bottles can really determine your age just by having writing on them. So the next thing we have is patent dates. Now these don't tell you exactly when the bottle were made, but they give you a time frame of when the bottle was made if there are more. So this is a Lincoln, Nebraska Root Coca-Cola bottle made by Roots, the manufacturer, on the bottom there. But this was patented on the back side. You see patented November 16th, 1950. These things ran about from 1915 till around 1922 when the next patent was formed. And that was the patent December 25th, 1923. This is also a Lincoln NEB Coca-Cola. And you just see that you can determine that the age is at least from 1923 onward. The next patent date we have is a Pat D. These were made from 1939 on to the early 50s till about 1951, I believe. And here you see that's a 1947. This one does have a code date that tells the age, from Fremont, Nebraska. Our last patent we have here is a patent office. You see the date is 1960. This one is from Chadron, Nebraska. And we just see that patent dates can give you a time range, a frame of when certain bottles were made, and it just really helps you determine the age of the spot you're digging in. So the next we have is a milk bottle found on East Campus UNL. This is a 1-quart property of Roberts Sanitary Dairy, Lincoln, Nebraska. And we see this maker has TMFG Co. 15 on the bottom, and that is actually a date code system that stands for 1915. So if you're looking up this bottle, you find this piece or that company with the 15 above, you can use that to determine that the age is in fact 1915 where you're digging. This is also a very rare bottle that I'm the only one to own, but this was only made in 1913. You see the 13 there. So you really get a time frame of just where your bottle is from, what is happening with it based on some of the date codes and how the bottles were made. Here we have an inkwell with this maker mark. You see it's that eye in the triangle or the whatever that shape is, but that was a glass maker from 1910 to about 20, and then it became this Owens, Illinois. It's an O and a square. It's hard to see, but these styles with the O on the bottom were made from 1915 to 1930. Any bottles with that on it. And then you see here, this paper label soda. You see it becomes that label, and that is a label from the 30s to the 50s and 60s. So you get age frames right away on these bottles, and they just help you to determine the ages. Here we have what's called an Art Deco style type soda. These bottles generally are made early 1900s, usually around 1910 to the 30s, and those give you a time frame on when these types were made. They are crown tops, So you just get a way better style and idea of where the bottle is from and where it's made. Next thing, paper labels can just give you an idea also of like how old the bottle is. This bottle is a Coca-Cola product from Beatrice, Nebraska called Sparkling Life. And the maker's mark shows that it's from 1939. But not a lot of labels survive. More labels are generally colored labels, especially, are from around the 1920s to the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So that gives you more of a time frame, and you can contrast that with the maker's mark usually to figure out when the bottle was made. Here we have a liquid veneer woodwork furniture. This would be an older label, most likely from the 1910s to 20s, and just finding that old label would show you that most likely this is a earlier bottle. Now we have bottle caps can tell you a lot, or the stoppers, like the Hutch stopper there tells you that age ranges from 1879 to 1912, where this is a screw top. And when screw tops started getting made, late 1800s, but around 1900 onward, you can kind of get an idea, and just based off, you know, the style or what it says or your maker's mark, you can determine age way better of a bottle. Most caps don't survive though. Another thing too, color. You have sometimes black glass, which was easily made only in the 1800s and like 1700s, 1600s. But you also have this purple color, and you can see it's kind of purple. That's called manganese glass. And this is a glass that was made around before 1915, sometimes into the 20s, but very rarely. And if this sits in the sun long enough, it begins to turn purple. And that just tells you that that glass has been sitting in the sun for around over 100 years. Instantly just gives your sight way more detail and info on what's happening, what's going on, where you are. So just with these bottles alone, finding these broken pieces or whole ones can give you a better idea of what you're digging, where you're at, the time frame. It can show you where these sodas, beers, medicines came from. And it can also tell you if there was a house or infrastructure there based on like what kinds of things they were throwing away. If it was an old bar, or if it was a house, if there were a lot of household items. There's a lot you can learn from these glass bottles just by looking at small things on them. And the small details will reveal a lot when you're looking at the archaeology of finding glass.